Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. We're continuing on in Unit 4, talking about political organizations of space. And what we've been talking about for the past several videos is the way that humans are dividing up the political landscape these days. Of course, we've talked about the nation state. We talked about the state as a unit of political geography. And last time we were talking about boundaries and borders. So we're going to continue on with that conversation, but specifically we're going to talk about some terms that refer to the ways that boundaries change over time. Again, the important thing to note here is, and this is what geography a lot is about how do things change over time, how do things change over space. Now, pretty much in the world today, there really is no change of boundaries over space. Pretty much the whole world is using similar systems in terms of using geometric boundaries, using physical landscape to create boundaries, but the notion of political boundaries and borders is pretty much going to be consistent throughout the world, and the idea of sovereignty and recognizing other territories and other states' boundaries is going to be really important to maintaining balance and good relationships on the international stage. So what we're looking at here is kind of an evolution of boundaries and the ways that our understanding of political boundaries have changed over time, and some of the different ways that we've used different understandings in order to create different political boundaries. And again, you have to think, if you're familiar with history at all, and you think back to the kings and queens, the tribes and things like that, borders and boundaries were kind of fuzzy, and you had to fight a lot to maintain those borders and boundaries. You had garrisons made for the strong kings and emperors of the ancient world. You had tribal clashes over territorial hunting lands and things like that. And really it was about how large was your military and what could you hold on to. Sometimes it was difficult to understand whose land was whose because of the difficulty of understanding how to mark the landscape and things like that. Of course, there are various ways to do that, but even today, it might be difficult to understand. But because of the new technology in terms of not boundaries, sorry, but satellites and things like that, GPS systems, we're able to create more accurate boundaries and more accurate understandings of boundaries. Even that doesn't mean we don't have conflicts. You look over in the South China Sea and the conflicts there over things like the Spratly Islands and different things, and these conflicts over who owns what territory, going back to the treaties in terms of what does the original language have to say about it, in terms of where the boundary is at and our understanding of the boundary today, of course, because we're much more precise. But anyway, so I guess I've been talking a little bit too much here, and so we'll move on with the actual material. So these are the four different types of boundaries that change that we're going to refer to: the antecedent boundary, the subsequent boundary, the superimposed boundary, and the relic boundary. And the important thing is here, and I'm going to give you the definition, and I'm going to give you some examples, but the best thing for you to do is to really think about some additional examples of what could be used within these terms, and also as you look at different situations, think about what would be the correct term to refer to that specific example that you're looking at, or maybe reading about, doing a case study, and those types of things. So the first type of boundary we'll look at is called the antecedent boundary. So basically what the antecedent boundary is a boundary that behaved as a boundary before humans made it a boundary. So when we look at the antecedent boundary is always going to be a physical feature on the landscape that creates separation. And that's why a lot of times physical features are co-opted into political boundaries, because they make sense, because they're large, they're easy to see, they're hard to traverse most of the time, and they've already created natural separation on the landscape. And so the people typically have taken different courses, they have different attitudes and behaviors. Again, the physical feature creates a distinguishing mark on the landscape that's really hard to miss. And I know here on the PowerPoint I have the Ohio River, and we talked about the Ohio River earlier. If you look on my map over here to the right, the Ohio River, the boundary that it creates. Even better example maybe is the Mississippi River, and of course you look over here on the map and the long line of state boundaries that it creates. And I also want to put this picture in here to kind of give you an idea of how large the Mississippi River. I don't think anybody's missing the Mississippi River when they walk upon it. Again, you can see how large the river is, what kind of separation it creates between the two states that are on either side of the river. before modern transportations and bridges and things like that, have been very difficult to get across. So it's very natural to use this and co-opt it into political boundaries and use it as a part of the boundary system that states have. So again, that's what the antecedent boundary is, and you have to again, the idea there is you need to think about kind of the natural progression there from the physical landscape to the political boundary, and how it makes kind of an easy fit into the system of political boundaries. The next one was called the subsequent boundary. So what the subsequent boundary is, it's a boundary that has been agreed upon by two or more parties kind of over time as elements have developed, whether it's wars or whether it's treaties that have been signed or the territories that have been settled. But the subsequent boundary has occurred over time. It's been agreed upon by two or more parties, and I guess a relatively amicable relationship between the two parties as they've established the boundary. So a good example of that would be the United States and the Canadian border. Now, I mean, early on we fought several wars with the British, and after the War of 1812, we were able to establish kind of the final borders there between the United States and Canada. It took us a little while to get some of those western borders figured out, but we finally got the treaty language and agreed upon those things. And again, I think I pointed this out in one of my previous videos, but CPG Gray has a great video on bizarre borders, and he talks specifically, it's in his second one, I believe, he talks specifically about the border between the United States and Canada and just kind of how crazy it is and how it's really not a straight line. And so, I would highly encourage you to look at that one because it incorporates the ideas of border making technology and some of the difficulties that the early surveyors had and things like that. But one of the things you'll notice, though, is that the subsequent boundary obviously doesn't necessarily have to use physical features. Of course, you have kind of the dividing of the Great Lakes here, but this right here is going to be a line of latitude, and so of course that's not necessarily always going to follow a physical feature. It could divide people in towns and things like that. In fact, it does divide people in towns that had historically lived together. So subsequent boundaries. Next we'll talk about what's the superimposed boundary. Now this is kind of a unique situation where the boundary is both created and enforced by an outside force. And so what's happened here is you have a situation where a third party has come in to establish the border, establish the boundary, and then oversee that boundary, at least for a limited period of time. And so two examples I have here is the State of Israel. Of course, State of Israel created after World War II out of the territory in Palestine. And of course, we're familiar with the conflict that created. Another good example that I was thinking about was what happened to the Ottoman Empire after World War I. So essentially, the Ottoman Empire was taken and was broken up as a result of World War I and the losses that the Ottoman Empire incurred as part of being on the losing side. And you can see what happened here. You had the development of Turkey, you had the establishment of the state of Turkey. Then you had these mandates that were set up by the British and the French. And you can see the modern day situation we have here with Lebanon, with Syria, with Iraq, so with Jordan. Sorry, I kind of lost it there for a second. But anyhow, you can see how this has been divided up. And some of these lines don't necessarily correspond with physical features, don't necessarily correspond with the cultural landscape, and so you can kind of begin to understand how the superimposed boundary sometimes can create conflict, just like what happened in Africa. Carving of the continent of Africa would also be a good example of that. Is when you combine groups of people. In fact, that's what a lot of people talk about with Iraq, talking about the groups of people, the Kurds to the north, the Sunnis and the Shias who live in the country. People talked about maybe dividing it up to a couple of different countries once the United States invaded Iraq. But again, the idea that an outside force comes in and imposes the boundary might create some sense of hostility to the people that live there. The anger or the resentment that they might feel for the outside forces coming in and imposing their will on the people. Certainly, the people living in Palestine that were displaced, they feel particularly angry about the situation, and still, obviously, that situation is going on today. So again, the superimposed boundary, and keep in mind, I mean, think about what superimposed means. It's kind of to lay on top of. and so that might help you to remember that particular situation. And last one we have is called the relic boundary. So the relic boundary is a boundary that used to be a boundary but no longer functions as a boundary. And so these were going to be boundaries that were established and created by humans, but that no longer function the same way that they did. So there's two good examples of that would be the Berlin Wall and the Great Wall of China. They still create separation. You can still see them. They're on the physical landscape, but they're no longer going to function in the way that they used to. And you know, the Great Wall of China is a pretty impressive feature. It's an ancient feature. It's pretty impressive. You can see it here in the mountains, you know, overseeing the kind of frontier territory of China. But again, boundaries that are no longer really being used. So that's why we have the term relic there. If you're familiar with what a relic is. So anyway, those are the 4 different types of boundaries that we're going to look at today. Again, this idea of how boundaries change over time, whether it's the understanding of the boundary, or the way the boundaries are administered, and things like that. Those are the ways that we get them. And now we will move on. We have a chance for another quiz ferret. So our furry little quiz ferret friend has popped his head out of the ground. He has a question for us before we leave today. And his question is, from the 4 types of boundaries that we just looked at, which type of boundary is most likely to be a physical feature? Pause the video, give yourself a second, and the answer is the antecedent boundary. I'm sure you got that one correct. So thank you, Quiz Ferret. Thank you everyone for watching, and we hope to see you again next time.